What's up, guys? Welcome back to another episode of Katson's Corner, the show where we go through what's been going on in college football, the scouting world, what the Chargers have been up to as it comes to the 2024 NFL Draft. Today, we've got a little bit of a change to the form of the show. The last couple weeks, if you've been around for the last few weeks, you know that like we've been skipping a few weeks of talking about games that the Charger scouts went and visited just because like they're going and visiting the same teams every week or they're not visiting very many games in a certain week or something. A couple weeks ago, we talked about the first wave of Shrine Bowl invites that came out. We've done a mock draft a few weeks ago. This week, we're going to talk about the kind of first wave of Senior Bowl commitments that have come out over the last like week or two. So very excited to get into that. We got a great slate of guys to talk about. Before we get into that, make sure you guys do all the YouTube stuff. I'm sure you guys know the drill at this point. Make sure you subscribe to the channel, hit the bell so that you get the notifications for the episodes. Go over to the Chargers channel, do the same stuff so you make sure that you get Steven and Tyler's episodes every week. All that sort of stuff. If you, like me in particular, want to follow my draft coverage outside of this series, make sure you follow me on Twitter at Alex Katson, the way you see it spelled on the screen there. And yeah, we will, I'll be doing all this sorts of stuff for the next few months. I'll be at the Shrine Bowl. I'll be at the Senior Bowl. We'll be covering these guys in person. Hopefully get a couple interviews nailed down, whether that's on here or wherever else it may be. But excited to get on that circuit and excited to talk about some of these guys. We're going to get right into it with West Virginia center Zach Frazier. If you have started doing your homework on the center class, this is a name you probably know. Frazier's in contention to be the top center drafted as of right now. I'd say it's probably still between him and Cedric Van Pran from Georgia. I know Oregon's Jackson Powers Johnson, who we've talked about on the show before, has been starting to gain a little bit more traction on Twitter and amongst like media scouts and stuff. But I think that it's still, as of right now, at least between Frazier and Van Pran, obviously still a lot of time for those things to change. Frazier accepted his Senior Bowl invite a couple days ago. He is a four-year starter, started as a true freshman, but was actually a guard freshman year, and then moved over to the center sophomore year, and this is his third year starting at center. So he does have a little bit of experience as guard as well, which is always great for a guy that you're drafting to not necessarily start right away. So like if the Chargers were to get Corey Linsley back, or bring Will Clapp back and start him as out as kind of like a bridge guy or something, Frazier has the ability to kind of cross train at guard as well and provide a little bit of extra depth in that area as well. It's pretty agile second level blocker, gets out in space well, pretty good at adjusting to like moving targets in the second level, to kind of like seal off gaps, kind of like adjust to what linebackers are doing as he's climbing up the field. He's a plus run blocker. Obviously that kind of agility in the second level helps with that. Solid pass blocker. I wouldn't say that he's like a plus player in that area right now, but he is solid. There are a couple of, it's up and down with him. I think that, it's more up than down most of the time, as it is with a lot of these guys that we're talking about that are going to get drafted kind of like that day two range. But there are a couple things that I want to see him clean up. One of those things is that he bends at the waist a lot. So with offensive line play, if you think about just like the way that, your leverage works, or like if you're lifting a box or something, right? You never want to bend at your waist because you're picking that box up like with your back and with your arms more than like getting the full leverage of your entire body strength by using your legs. It's kind of the same thing when you're playing offensive line. If you're bending at the waist, it means that you're using all of the power in your upper body, like in your back and in your your core and your arms, but you're not getting any power from your legs. Versus if you're bending at the knees, you're getting all that power from your legs as well as you kind of like do the lineman punch stuff from like that wider base. Frazier does have a little bit of problems with bending at the waist instead of the knees. I do want to see him get a little bit better with that. And then I do have some functional strength questions with him. Part of that does come from the whole waist bending thing, but part of it is a more general thing of just like there are a couple times where it doesn't look like he is necessarily quite as strong as some of these other players. He's playing in the Big 12. They've got a lot of talent at defensive tackle this year. And so that could be part of it as well. But obviously coming to the NFL, you're going to be playing against top tier talent every week. So another area for him to improve in. But overall, really excited to get him down to Mobile. I think that he's going to be one of those guys that you're going to be watching very closely in those like O line, D line one on ones. See how he performs and could really like do wonders for his stock during that week. Moving on here to Florida State tight end Jaheim Bell. This is a guy who's been on radars for a couple years. Transferred to Florida State, I believe it was before last season from South Carolina. Was a guy who kind of came onto the radar at South Carolina. A lot of people were really excited about him. Um, I think there was a couple injuries or something that kind of like nicked him up a little bit. He's kind of like bounced around, not like school wise, but just kind of like perception wise, I guess, as far as the draft goes. Ends up at Florida State, where he's kind of like become the number one tight end, but not the number one passing option like he was at South Carolina. Obviously, Florida State's got those two incredible wide receivers, Keon Coleman and Johnny Wilson on the outside. But Bell is kind of a Swiss Army knife. They kind of move him all over the formation. They'll split him out wide and play him as like kind of a true receiver. They'll put him in line, play him at tight end. They'll kind of move him off the formation, play him in more of like a fullback, H-back sort of role. A lot of the comparisons that I've seen have been like Chig Okonkwo. If you remember a couple years ago, he ended up going to the Titans. I think that that's more of like a usage comparison and not necessarily like a play style comparison, but just kind of like that same sort of like Swiss Army knife. You're going to move them all over the formation, have them do like different things all the time. Um, and then the other one that I've seen a lot is Gerald Everett, the current Chargers tight end. And I think a lot of reason for that is that Bell is a very advanced runner after the catch. Obviously, we've seen in kind of limited opportunity this season what Everett has been able to do after the catch when kind of given those like flat, those like shallow routes, like 1 or 2 yards past the line of scrimmage, and then he like breaks 3 tackles and gets a first down. Bell has the capability to do that. He's not as much of a tackle breaker as he is a like more like elusive sort of player in space, but he's a surprisingly savvy route runner. He's a great mover for his size. He's like 6'3", 239, which is a little bit light for a tight end, which does bring into some stuff about his run blocking ability, which of course for the Chargers is a big point of emphasis for the tight ends. Their tight ends have been terrible blockers this season, and so you wonder if that kind of like eliminates him from consideration from a Chargers perspective. But also, uh, all of the guys that they have in the room right now aren't very good at blocking, and so maybe that's just the kind of guy that they like. So maybe it actually makes it more of a consideration. You never know with these sorts of things. And then also the one concern about him is just going to be like his true positional fit. I think he's going to end up playing a little bit of fullback in Mobile. Jim Nagy, who's the director of the Senior Bowl, has already said that they're not inviting any true fullbacks this year because they don't have anyone with a draftable grade. Typically, when that happens, or when that's happened in the past couple years, they have some of those like smaller tight end prospects that are gonna be guys that move around the formation a whole lot anyway. Play fullback during that week a little bit to kind of like show that they can do it and show that they are a little bit more versatile. So I think that Bell is going to end up being one of those guys that takes some of those reps. We'll see how he does, obviously. I think that he's someone that has the capability to do that. If you kind of think about like the way that another FSU tight end that ended up on the Chargers was used before he was cut earlier this year, kind of like that Trey McKitty role where he was playing fullback a little bit towards the end there, could be something that they look into with Bell as well. Moving on to Arizona wide receiver Jacob Cowing. This is a guy who played 3 seasons at UTEP, was a great receiver for them over in El Paso, and then transferred to Arizona before the 2022 season to be closer to his, I believe it's, I can't remember what gender his kid is, but he moved closer to be, he moved to Arizona to be closer to his kid, who's being raised by the mother of the child. And so transfers over to Arizona and really broke out in the 2022 season, had a huge season, and was really just like this dynamic, like super crazy yak threat. I honestly thought he could have come out and like declared for the draft last season. Would have been a 4th-year player last year. He's a 5th-year player now. And so someone that was definitely on these All-Star game radars coming into the season, and also like coming out of last season. And accepted a Senior Bowl invite a couple days ago. He's going to be down in Mobile. This season has been a little bit more up and down for him. He's been banged up a little bit, and a lot of his catches that led to all of this yak opportunity in 2022 have been a little bit more congested this season. One of Arizona's receivers, Dorian Singer, transferred to USC, which has kind of like shrunk the field a little bit for them this season. Um, Obviously, they've got Cowing and they have Tetaroa McMillan, who's going to be a top guy next year. Not eligible this season as a true sophomore, but he's going to be a guy next year. But last year they had those two guys and Dorian Singer, who was kind of more of like their deep stretch threat guy. They haven't really found a guy like that this season, and so it's made the middle of the field and like kind of the underneath areas a little bit more congested as people get more familiar with Cowing's game, which is along with the injuries led to some declines in his stats this season. But overall, he's still a very good underneath route runner that has great yak potential, and he's just got like this smoothness to him. I really can't explain this more than just like uh, sometimes when you watch guys, you can just tell that they have this sort of like smoothness to them. They have this sort of like effortlessness to them. I don't want to call it like pure just like vibe scouting, but it is just kind of like the more you watch a guy, the more you kind of like get a feel for like this is a guy that just like is a football player, like just like is a gamer, like just like gets it. And you get that feeling when you watch Cowing's film. I get that's a very like nebulous thing, and it's hard to put like a defined like quantifiable like trait grade sort of thing on that, but it's just kind of like it's kind of just like a feeling, for lack of a better word. But he has it. He has it, and he is going to struggle against press. He's a lighter guy. He's listed at 175, I think. Also listed at 5'11. I think he's going to come in shorter than that. I'm very interested to see what his official measurements in mobile are going to be, because I don't think that he's 5'11. And he's never going to be an elite NFL athlete. He's probably going to be a kind of like typical slot receiver, as like smaller guy, lighter guy, gonna be kind of like your underneath specialist, isn't gonna beat guys with like athleticism or anything off the line, but is just like has this sort of like savvy about him, has this sort of just like understanding of the way that routes work and the way that like, where his quarterback wants him to be, where the holes in the zones are and stuff. Almost like the way that we talk about tight ends as security blankets on this channel. But kind of that same thing, but just like from a smaller slot receiver. Um, Obviously, that's not something that the Chargers necessarily need, with Keenan Allen looking like he's going to come back next season, who operates out of the slot as much as he does. But the Chargers have moved him around a lot more this year, and so maybe drafting a guy who can play a little bit more of a defined role from the slot is something that they would be interested in, to get Keenan moved around on the outside a little bit more and kind of like get more multiple with their personnel. But we'll have to see. Moving on here to the defensive side, we've got Missouri edge rusher Darius Robinson. I did put him at edge because he's played edge this season for the Tigers, but before this, he did play 3 seasons on the interior. So he's kind of a guy that's moved around the defensive line. He's 6'5", 290, so kind of like right in between what you're looking for from like a prototypical edge body type and a prototypical defensive tackle body type. Um, Arms are reportedly 35 and a quarter, which is long. If you don't know, that's long. 34-ish, 34, 35, or I guess like 33 to 35-ish is usually the threshold for like how long you want an offensive tackle's arms to be. So you can kind of like extrapolate that to the opposite side of the ball and say like that's usually about what you want from edge rushers. So 35 and a quarter is like right at the top end of that, like our like lower threshold. So dealing with plenty of length here. Those long arms, along with his like technically advanced hands, lead to a lot of plays where he just like dusts a lineman instantly and is in the backfield immediately. He's got a lot of power in those hands. The long arms give him a lot of leverage. He's able to strike first a lot of the time because he's got that length. And so that really helps him out as a pass rusher. He's also got a really high motor, and he's a very creative guy as a pass rusher. So he chains moves together fairly well. Has a high motor, so like when the play starts to get long, when the quarterback's kind of like running around out of structure and stuff, he's always kind of like working still, and like will gets a lot of effort sacks that way, just kind of like working back towards the action. There are some times where he works himself out of plays also, where he just kind of like gets a little bit too overactive. It's more of a problem in the run game a lot of the times, where like he'll try to penetrate upfield, a little bit too eagerly and then like leave a hole behind him. Some of that stuff does come down to coaching too. You have to kind of look at like, is that the way that other players on Missouri's defense are being coached? Like when he comes out of the game, is that what the guy that comes in at his position is also being asked to do? Is that what the guy on the other side of the formation is being asked to do too? Like, is he also doing that? Because sometimes these college teams do coach just like, hey man, you're getting after the quarterback. Just get after the quarterback. Don't worry about the run game. There's a guy filling in behind you. Um, and so sometimes those like kind of upfield penetrators get knocked for that sort of thing when it's actually a coaching point and it's not like a flaw in their game. And so that's something that I want to personally go back and check with him. Because I do know, like I did notice just like from watching live games of Missouri this year that he has done that a few times. But it doesn't necessarily mean that it's like a him problem. It might be just like a Missouri coaching point. It might be it might be something that is completely fixable. It might be something that like we get to Mobile and he doesn't do it anymore, and all of a sudden it's like, oh, I guess that was just what he was being asked to do. So that's always something to keep an eye on. I do think also that he's got kind of a tweener body type, as I kind of touched on, like 6'5", 290, 35-inch arms, kind of big to play on the edge. I think that he's going to be a little bit susceptible to like outside zone runs and like, he's going to get walled off by these more like agile tackles in the NFL if he does play edge full time. If he moves to the interior, he's a little bit light, so it gets a little bit dicey there. I think that his best fit is probably going to be at like 5 tech in like a heavy front, or playing like strong side defensive end in a 4-3. And so is that the best fit for the Chargers? Maybe not necessarily, but the way that the Chargers have gotten so multiple with their personnel and how they move guys around and everything, like I think that tweeners like this are a little bit more appealing to them than they might be to other teams, just because like it's a little bit easier for them to kind of like move these guys around and put them in the best spots to succeed. But that is going to be kind of like a struggle with his evaluation, like league wide, that may like push him down the board a little bit. But ultimately, he's a player that I really like, and you've probably heard in other places, kind of just like around the draft community, like there's this mantra of just like draft guys that are good at football. Darius Robinson is a good football player. You should draft good football players. And so he's someone that I really like. I think that he would make any team better, as long as you can find like a reasonable enough role for him. But I think as long as you're playing him 5 tech or out, like that, all of those are going to be reasonable roles that he'll be able to find some level of success with. All right, moving on to the MAC. We've got Toledo cornerback Quinyon Mitchell. His name may be familiar to you if you follow the work of Dane Brugler, the athletic draft guru, who, if you don't follow his work and you're watching the show, you should go follow his work, because he is A, my inspiration, and I want his job, and B, he's the best in the game. And so you should be following him and making sure that you are up to date on everything that he thinks, because he has people in the league that he talks to about stuff, and that directly influences the way that he grades players and gives information out about people, and that's good. That's good stuff to know. And in Brugler's most recent top 50 board, Quinyon Mitchell was on it. And not only was he on it, he was in the top half. He was number 25 overall. This is a guy who was first team All MAC last season, probably going to be first team All MAC this season, if not winning MAC Defensive Player of the Year. Probably won't this year. His ball production's been a little bit down, but he could. Toledo's the best team in the MAC, and he's the best defensive player on the best team in the MAC, so he certainly could. In his career, he's got 50 pass deflections and 6 interceptions. That 50 pass deflection number is insane. He had 25 of those last season. And so this is a guy who's always around the ball. He's always around the ball. He's always making a play on the ball. That is like the number one thing that you want out of corner, right? But he's also a physical run defender, which, if you've watched the last few Chargers games, you've realized has been a problem with the corners on this team, especially when it relates to taking angles to ball carriers. There's one play from the Packers game in particular that I can think of where I think it was Asante Samuel that just took like a horrendous angle I think it was on the Jaden Reed jet sweep touchdown. But just like one of the worst angles I've seen in a long time. Mitchell doesn't have that problem. He's a big hitter, physical run defender, is willing to do it, will hit guys over the middle as well, like, like not afraid to lay the wood whatsoever. Um, but he's also got loose hips with high end speed. What that means is that he's able to hang with pretty much any route. Loose hips is really just like jargon for like changes direction well. So like works well against comebacks and like in breaking, out breaking routes. Any routes that have any sort of like break to them, where it's like any sort of like change of direction. He's able to flip his hips and kind of like get moving in the right direction very quickly. That's what we mean by loose hips there. And then he's also got the high end speed to kind of like hang with those guys as they run downfield on like those go routes and stuff. There are going to be some level of competition issues. The MAC is probably the worst conference in FBS football. And if not worse, they're probably ninth out of 10. They're not very good. It's not a very good conference. It's been a little bit better this season, but it's not very good still. Toledo is kind of the best team by a little bit. And so there are going to be some issues there in terms of like, hey, this guy hasn't really played against like top level athletes in his career. And that's warranted, but that's also why he took the Senior Bowl invite, because he's going to do that for a whole week. He does get a little bit too high on his back pedal sometimes, getting a little bit nitpicky there. But one of those things where it's just like, you keep a little bit of explosiveness if you stay low in that back pedal to kind of like click and close a little bit better. Click and close is not really an issue for Mitchell, but the fact that it's not an issue while he's still getting too high on his back pedal like that tells me that like he could be even better with it, which is insane. And so I do want to see him get a little bit better at it, just because like I want to see what it looks like. It'd be nice. Moving on here to one of the sleepers that the Senior Bowl has gotten a commitment from. That is New Hampshire running back Dylan. I think it's Laube. I think it's Laube. He is a sixth-year senior at the University of New Hampshire, which is an FCS school in the Colonial Athletic Association. They play football like with Villanova and like University of Albany and like schools like that, like Rhode Island, Northeastern schools. They played Central Michigan this year, and Laube had 295 yards receiving as a running back. That's an FCS record for receiving yards by a running back in a single game, and he did it against the only FBS school on New Hampshire's schedule. So yeah, that'll get you on draft radars pretty quickly. He is a six-year senior. He's kind of like really only broken out like 2022 and this year, like only really like the last 2 years. This season, he has close to 750 yards rushing with almost 700 yards receiving. And he's drawn a lot of comparisons to Chargers legend Danny Woodhead. So you think about Woodhead, undrafted guy from, I think it was from a D2 school up in the Northeast. Worked his way onto the team like as a kick returner, did special team stuff, and then like eventually gets on the field as a running back and like was pretty equally effective as a running back, but was especially good as a receiver. That's going to be kind of like the path that Laube is trying to chart here. There are going to be some questions about like the fact that he's a late breakout player in the FCS against pretty weak competition. The Colonial Athletic Association is not a particularly strong FCS conference. Albany won the conference at 9-3 overall. I don't think they're a very high seed in the FCS playoffs. It's not like he's playing against like North Dakota State and South Dakota State every week, is what I'm trying to say. And so Senior Bowl week is going to be big for him. I think that with a good week, he probably ends up getting drafted and he like gets, somewhere in there. With a middling to like not very good week, he probably slips to like a UDFA type guy. But someone that's going to be kind of the talk of the town that week, because anytime that a small school guy like that is there, he's always kind of the talk of the town. And so someone that I'm very interested to get eyes on for sure. Moving on to our games next week, it is rivalry week, which means that a lot of these games have extra stakes attached. Oklahoma TCU is not one of those because Oklahoma already played their two rivals, Texas and Oklahoma State. They do those earlier in the year for reasons. But Oklahoma's got a right tackle, Tyler Guyton, who's going to be a day 2 pick. Not necessarily going to be a guy that's on the Chargers radar, I don't think. But someone to keep an eye on is just like a top name because I think he's a good player. And so it's fun to watch good players. And then also Billy Bowman, we've talked about on the show before, but he's had a really strong season at safety for them. Could be someone the Chargers look into with the situation in the secondary right now. TCU cornerback Josh Newton, also a guy we've talked about before. We talked about him on the Shrine Bowl episode. He's going to have a pretty big test against Oklahoma. They've got a couple receivers that do a lot of different things, and so if he's not going to be moving around and covering one of them in particular, he's going to have like a very like wide gauntlet of things. Nick Anderson is kind of like they're more like go ball type guy, like they're more like down the field, like field stretcher sort of guy. Jaleel Farouk is more of like a typical Z receiver, like you're throwing screens and like quick stuff to him. And then Drake Stoops out of the slot has been like their most productive receiver. And so Newton, I think, will probably get reps against all three. And so he'll kind of get to show a couple of different things in that game. So I'm excited to see how he does there. Ohio State versus Michigan. I could not do this episode without talking about the game, which is going to be, I think it's number 2 versus number 3. We'll see how the college football playoff ranking shakes out tomorrow, or today, I guess, if you're watching this on Tuesday. But Ohio State running back TreVeyon Henderson is going to be RB1 if his medicals check out. He's been healthy the last couple weeks after dealing with some injuries, like most of last year, early half of this year, and he has looked at as advertised. He's going to be the RB1 if he's healthy. That's just how it is, which is great because before this, the RB class was looking a little bit weak. On the edge, JT Tuimalau has had a solid season. I wouldn't say he's had a great season. He's someone that I think honestly could end up coming back to school to do his senior year. But with a weak edge class this year, I could also see him coming out and declaring for this year's draft. More of a power rusher guy, just like kind of a pocket pusher, doesn't really have any sort of like finesse to his game still. Probably a guy that you take like early day 2 if he does end up coming out. And then Michigan defensive lineman Chris Jenkins has kind of gotten overshadowed by Mason Graham that's at Michigan. Mason Smith is at LSU. Mason Graham, who has had like a killer last couple weeks. Kenneth Grant has had a killer couple weeks as well. But Chris Jenkins is a really, really good defensive tackle in his own right. NFL blood. His dad played, I think, like almost a decade in the NFL, mostly with the Jets. And so excited to see how he does against that Ohio State offensive line that has kind of like been up and down this season. Clemson, South Carolina. Not necessarily like a super huge game or anything, but neither team is ranked. South Carolina's had kind of a rough season. Clemson is Clemson, but they've got Will Shipley, the running back, who is drawn comparisons, whether warranted or not, to Christian McCaffrey. He has been kind of Clemson's entire offense the last couple of weeks. He's been fantastic. And so watching him carve up a South Carolina defense that has struggled a little bit this year should always be fun to watch. Someone to look at in kind of like the mid rounds if he does end up coming out. They've also got an edge, Xavier Thomas, who's been on radars for a couple of years. He's in his 6th year of college now. Just kind of like a solid rotational guy. Clemson uses him as the rotational guy because they've got a million edge rushers on the team. He's going to be a rotational guy in the NFL. Kind of a late round UDFA type guy to keep an eye on, is just like a super experienced, like very like savvy sort of guy to add to that rotation. And then South Carolina wide receiver Xavier Legette has kind of been talked about as like the biggest riser of the draft so far this season. Really took over the wide receiver 1 duties when Juice Wells got injured. He's missed basically the whole season. He actually just announced tonight that he's coming back to South Carolina next year. But Legette is out of eligibility after the season. He's a 5th-year senior that did not redshirt his first year on campus. And he's taken over as wide receiver 1. He's been fantastic. Kind of a bigger yak receiver, is like 6'3", I think, but really does most of his damage after the catch. But he's going to be, featured heavily in this game, and so I would keep an eye on him as well. And then Florida Atlantic versus Rice in the American Conference. We've got 2 wide receivers that have been basically their team's entire offense this season. Florida Atlantic's wide receiver LeJontay Wester has been phenomenal. When he's on, Florida Atlantic wins games. If the other team is able to stop him, Florida Atlantic loses the game. Last week, Tulane stopped them. They stopped him rather. Florida Atlantic scored 8 points in the whole game. But he's also had games where he's had like 3 or 4 touchdowns. Also plays special teams. He's got punt return experience. He's a great player. And then Luke McCaffrey at Rice, we've talked about before, Christian's little brother. He's Rice's basically entire offense, is the most productive receiver on that team by far. Is really the only guy that's doing much of anything on that team offensively. That's going to do it for this week, guys. Hope you enjoyed as always. We will be back next week to talk about something, I'm sure. We might preview the conference championship games, might do another mock draft, might do some more all-star stuff like this. Let me know what you want me to do. Yeah, we'll just do that. Let me know what you want me to do, and I'll do it. And I will see you guys next week for that one. And until then, take care. Try to hang in there with the way that the Chargers are playing. It will get better because it's almost draft season, baby. See ya.